Kumar Datatrain here with Agile Meridian, and we're up to our 13th episode of the SAFE series. Lucky or unlucky 13, I don't know. But for this episode, which Michael and I, we're going to be talking about the Innovation and Planning Sprint. It's a construct that's part of the PI, the program Increment. The program Increment typically ends in this thing that is called the Innovation and Planning Sprint. And I was actually in a leadership training session earlier today, and one of the participants said, who's in a company that uses SAFE, Scaled Agile Framework, said, this innovation planning sprint, I just can't get people to do it. I can't get people to dedicate the time for innovation, and I can't get leaders to see the value in it. And so we had a discussion about that. And I thought it was a really appropriate question. We're talking about innovation in a very disruptive time right now. Of course, we're pretty much out of COVID, but now the big disruption is artificial intelligence and Chat GPT and all the competitors to Chat GPT, right? And so innovation is such a critical piece. And so why aren't people embracing this free sprint, if you will, to do whatever the heck you want and innovate, Michael?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what I've seen over the last 10 years or so of trying to have that same battle, right? This IMP is brilliant. Why don't we use it? I can tell you I've seen it go both ways. More, of course, to what you found, which is let's not use this, or we can't really figure out how to use it. I will tell you that when people have successfully implemented it and actually used it as intended, there's a lot of failed attempts where they kind of try to make it their own thing and they don't do what's intended. But when they use it as it was intended to, I've seen people defend it. Like they don't want to give it up. No, this works really well for us. And I think really it comes down to this idea, the tyranny of the urgent, right? Our companies and our cultures are so used to deliver. When you talk about, wait a minute, I'm going to take a whole 2 weeks, a sprint, an iteration. I'm going to come off out of the trenches. I'm going to come off the front lines. I'm going to slow down and take a breath. I'm going to do some planning. I'm going to do some demos and maybe some root cause analysis, some deep dive into my system. Oh, and I'm going to do some team builders and some training. And what I think is really hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around is that we're going to take a sprint as it's a feedback loop. Certainly it's a feedback loop to that bigger planning increment or program increment that you're talking about, certainly. But it's also, it's kind of that guardrail that says, take a deep breath. Don't plan work for this time period, not your normal work. We're going to do some other things. I think for a lot of companies, a lot of cultures to say, wait a minute, we're pausing, but what about all these deadlines and all this pressure to deliver? That's my initial thought when you think about, what's kind of behind that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's that tyranny of the urgent that prevents some of that thinking. Also, I think it's language, right? People in most companies, when you talk to people and say, okay, we're going to do some innovation activities, at least I am, I don't know about you, Michael, met with a blank stare. It's like, what's that? Right? What's that? What is this innovation time? What is this innovation activity? What are you expecting me to do? I just give me the work, tell me what you want and I'll go do it. And when you say, no, let's, you go innovate. I think we need to define what innovation is.
Yeah.
And to me, innovation is a byproduct of a fail fast mindset, right? And because if you can fail fast, then you are more inclined to experiment, to take risks, to innovate, to come up with new ways to do things. And because again, the cost of failure is pretty low. And the team is all sort of working from the same general script that, hey, we can take risks, we can innovate. To innovate is to take risks. To innovate is to think outside the box. We're not going to get punished for it. And so when you dedicate a whole sprint to innovation, of course, people are going to be like, what the heck am I going to do? How is this different from any other sprint? Just give me the work. Managers are like, oh, no, there's more work to do. We have more work to do. We can't be doing that innovation stuff. So to me, I think it starts with defining what is innovation. Yeah. What do you think about that?
You nailed it. I mean, I know that when I've actually been successful in getting an IMP up and running, we literally have to do we have to run an innovation workshop. I run it in two different ways. I'll come in and say, okay, let's define what innovation is, right? What's the difference between innovation in your day-to-day and innovation at the end of some planning increment? I teach innovation as it's a collision of minds coming together to solve some problem. And it's those sharing of ideas that you get this kind of new idea, right? Or a conglomeration of ideas. And you have to teach them how to actually formulate the idea. How do you brainstorm? How do you come together? How do you pitch your idea back to your organization? Once I've got this great idea we came up with, we got to get funding. We got to talk about it, right? And then, that's the bigger innovation picture. And then you have to think about also, each human being is capable of innovation in their day-to-day. But once again, it comes back to that tyranny of the urgent. We're so used to putting our heads down especially in the technology industry. We get our requirements, we get our stories or acceptance criteria, and we go get our test cases. We put our head down and we code, or market, or brand, whatever we're doing. And once you do that, there's no slack time built in there. I'm sure you've heard the statement, innovation is in the slack. And it is, because you got to take a breath for a second so your brain can, stop trying to deliver and say, okay, let me think about other ideas and the way our brain works. So yeah, I agree with you. I think you have to teach them, you have to teach people how to innovate. And then what do you do when you have an idea? How, take that innovation, because we have a whole world of great ideas. I mean, everybody has great ideas and we can't deliver on them all. So how do you get that prioritized? How do you get that funded, or whatever the model is you're trying to use? Yeah. I use the pitch. I can't remember the gentleman's name off the top of my head, but I actually how to pitch your ideas, and it's the 3-minute pitch, right? And it's a wonderful tool for teaching people. Okay, you've got a great idea. Now, what do you do with it, right?
Right. But I agree with all that. I think also that it's not something you can schedule. If there's a fault with the IP sprint, I think it's in that there's assumption that at the end of the program increment, the team is going to sort of go off and innovate. And to me, that's a flawed concept. To me, innovation happens all the time. It happens every day. It happens every sprint. And in that sense, you wouldn't need an innovation sprint, because every day you would have slack built in to your day to work with your teammates to innovate, to have that collusion of ideas, that conglomeration of ideas, as you mentioned, that create something new and powerful. An experiment that may or may not work, but it's a result of that innovation mindset. And that might solve some of the problems that we're seeing in the field, where we've got this innovation planning sprint. We've got to think about all the things we want to do in that innovation planning sprint. Wait, we don't have time to do that because we didn't complete all the work that we committed to in our regular sprints or iterations in the PI. So we got to finish that first. And then if there's some time left, then we'll do these innovation activities. Rather, what if it was, hey, let's engineer some slack each day into our day, teach people what it means to innovate, give them the freedom to fail and learn from failure, to experiment and learn from the experiments, and let them innovate all the time. What are your thoughts there?
You nailed it, right? So, I take this as we're talking about scaled agile and the IMP, right? The innovation and planning sprint, or the iteration. When you think about the problems that Scaled is trying to solve, they're trying to help these super large corporations, our Fortune 500s and above, right, break out into a new way of working. And to your point, when you see innovation working at its best, Google's a great example. They now have it's Innovation Fridays, and their culture is every Friday they're looking for ways to make time for people, to make sure there's time for them to think about innovation and think about new ideas, right? And so it's a big part of their culture, and it's still going strong, because I just validated it just a few weeks ago. But you think about what you said, right? It's how do we get that in the day-to-day? And when you look at a really high-performing, lean, agile team, doesn't matter what version of agile, they understand and embody what lean means and agile, and they're collaboratively functioning. So they're not getting their story and going and working it in a little silo by themselves, like most people waterfall agile, that's what we see. They're not really, but when they start acting like a collaborative application team or a UX team, man, you see it unlock every day. To your point, they work together, so you're getting that collision of ideas. They're not heads down jumping from task to task, quietly in their little silos. They're able to innovate that much better. And that has time for that built right in because of their collaborating, the way they're collaborating. And I think failed with the IMP is trying to, maybe it's a stepping stone to true maturity, but it's trying to get the larger culture to shift and say, hey, here's a time box for you to make for those things. I mean, the IMP is way more than just innovation, as you know. It's got quite a few uses there. But I agree with you. I think maybe it's a stepping stone, and I think the real maturity and innovation is how do you build that into your day-to-day?
I think so. There's the experience I'd like to share with you, and with not just with you, Michael, but whoever's watching. That is with a company I used to work for a while back, almost 12 years ago. I won't mention any names, but they were way ahead of their time. They've been doing Agile since XP, actually, since 2003 or so, 2002, which is right after the manifesto was written. Of course, XP had been around a lot longer than that. And they had 1 week sprints, right? And every Friday in the morning, they would demo their work to their stakeholders. They would do the retrospect, and at this company, they would bring lunch in on Fridays. So Friday lunch would go to their lunch, have lunch. And then the afternoon was theirs to do whatever they want to. With everyone in the company had innovation time. The difference is that this company had defined what that meant for them, right? And so the people were expected to have side projects, things that they were learning, things that they were improving upon. Sort of prototypes that they were working on, things like that. The only thing that the company asked for in return is that once a month they did a demo day, and it was for an hour. And I can't remember the time they did it, but the people that had something to show would show what they had been working on, or what book they had read, or what conference they went to, or how many bugs they were able to squash, or whatever, right? It was just a free for all. Whoever wanted to got up there and showed their work. And the interesting thing is that this company, 90% of their new product ideas came from those 4 hours every week, right? That was spent on innovation. It was amazing. And now, not to say that they weren't innovating the rest of the time, because these were high-performing, high-functioning teams, 6-person teams, no more, no less, 6-person teams. They called themselves engineers. They did everything. They could do everything. They were multi-skilled, E-shaped people. So they were developers, they were testers, they were analysts, they were automators, they were whatever they needed to be, right? And they did Pomodoro pairing. So they would pair in 2-hour sessions with other members of the team, right? 3 sessions a day, 6 members a team. It works great. And so they were always innovating, but they still had that extra time set aside to do even more innovative activities. And that was, to me, that was the best experience I had seeing that kind of innovation. Yeah.
I've never seen it quite that powerful. What I'll tell you is where I see it sticking, and the successful times where people started fighting, don't take away my IMP, was it looked a lot like what you were describing, and I have one client in mind specifically. They started it out like we convinced them. I was our actual coach at the time. We convinced the teams. It was about 9 Agile teams in an art. And we convinced them to do an IMP, and they hadn't done one. They'd done 5 PIs with no IMP. Or they just management didn't want to hear it. I don't want to hear about. No, we don't have time for that, right? We finally convinced them, and what really sold them on it was the first thing we did is we promised not to interrupt the rest of the PI with training and distractions. We wanted to keep the teams in the zone as long as possible. We know that increases flow. We know in the zone, right? And so we moved all the distractions out of the PI into this IMP. So team builders, corporate training, individual training, there was all those things, right? And then they started a series of hackathons, which was just awesome. They took something from the root cause analysis of their demo and their inspect and adapt workshop and said, let's make this better. It's not working well for us today. Brought in the whole organization during that 2 weeks. They brought in all the teams and all the team members, and they could pick. It was almost like a science fair. You could pick the topic, and they all just swarmed around it in these kind of, self-organized teams, documented it. They had to do a presentation, kind of like what you were talking about. What are your ideas? What do you think? How could we fix this? They did some heat mapping. The first time it was chaos. It was just crazy chaos. And I'll be honest, I didn't think they were going to let us do it again, because I was like, oh gosh, it was a mess. Yeah. And I had great help there. I had 2 RTEs that were really part of it, and a Scrum Master manager that we were all trying to make it work. And I'll tell you though, about the second or third one, we had some things figured out. They did away with some of it, but the hackathons, those were really popular for probably the next year, the next 3 or 4 PIs we saw. And it sounded a lot like what you were describing, where they're coming together. They're trying to innovate all the time, but that was where they brought this kind of focus time. They did pairing, or they did self-formed small teams.
Right.
And it just really worked well for that organization.
Yeah, that sounds very similar. So at this place, the prototypes that they were building, they worked that way. They would pair up or have small groups that worked on things on their prototypes, which they would eventually show at the demo day. So it was really something. So in terms of this video, what do we tell people? What advice do we give people that are struggling with their INP sprint? You go first. What would you say?
Well, I know general pushback on IMP is usually management. Management is, do we really have time to do this with the delivery load and the commitments that we have in place? And so you're going to have to really get some sponsor buy-in by your managers, directors, and VPs for something like that. The technique that I used there was very simply saying, listen, it's a time and place. Let's move distractions, because if you're doing 5 sprints in your PI or 4 sprints in your PI, we're going to give you 4 or 5 solid sprints. We're not going to allow any distractions. We want the teams to stay focused. You're going to see your quality go up, right? Your defects will come down, because we're not context shifting. We're going to start eliminating that. And then the thing that I use the most is, listen, one of the hackathon ideas or the innovation ideas has to be something that's important to those leaders. What's the problem? We had what we call the hardening period with this org I was telling you about, where every time they did a release, there was like 3-4 weeks of the hardening time, and it was horrible. And we said, we'll hackathon that and reduce that hardening period. They did. They got it down to a week, actually, and very quickly. And so that sold the idea. Well, you see that by making time for that and allowing the teams, they came up with the solution. So that's how I would approach it. And then once you get it into place, you got to maximize the use. We had all our team builders. We had, all your icebreakers. You had all your training in that time period. Of course, you're doing the system demo and the inspect and adapt workshop and your feedback loops for scaled Agile implement or increment. But we made sure to maximize the time. And if you're going to do that, make sure you're organized and you have a strong agenda that's communicated, so you can really make it work.
I like all of those things. I think those are very, very practical ways to make the INP more valuable and maybe actually have organizations use it. I think educating what innovation is, it can be a precursor to all of this stuff. The types of things that could happen in the INP sprint. Is there a way to inject more slack time in each sprint? So it's not all at the end of the PI. Maybe that's an option for certain organizations that are more mature, but certainly the things that you mentioned can be really helpful.
Yeah.
All right. Any closing thoughts before we close out this video?
Yeah, I think I would leave it with an IMP in itself, by definition, is a scaled Agile construct that, as you said at the beginning, it's designed as a sprint 2 weeks long at the end of an increment or a planning cycle. But we're just cut it down to what the real principles are. It's an opportunity to focus on those things that may not be delivery related, but that add value to either your planning, your ability to plan and look ahead, your ability to learn from your mistakes, those feedback loops, and your ability to allow your team members, all those people that are working so hard for you, to take a step off the front lines, take a breath, think about problems, slow down just a little bit. And I think if you look at it from that perspective, it doesn't matter what you call it, that's really the heart of what we're trying to do when we think about the IMP.
I agree. I think that's great. That's a great summary of it. It harkens for me when you said that these are really intangibles. You know, like if you think of Kanban and flow and you have the different classes of service, INP and the work that goes on in there they're intangibles. You don't really know the value of it until you do it, until you finish something. And then the value can be so great that it outweighs some of the things that you do that have direct customer impact. So that's great. Thanks for this. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you got some value out of it, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.